This is Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. For those who don't know us, we're a member-supported nonprofit. We help to answer questions like what is high-speed rail, why we need to build it, and what steps need to be taken in order to make it happen in North America. And we give you the tools and resources you need to educate your elected leaders and other key leaders in your communities about how they can get engaged in making high-speed and regional rail a reality. We're looking forward to a national program that includes both high-speed rail and shared use lines and intercity buses working together to connect big towns, small towns across essentially all 50 states, although of course Hawaii won't be connected directly to the others. For those again who are new, if you would like, you can see in the background there's a Cleveland poster. If you go to highspeedrail.us, go up to the upper right-hand corner and hit Get Merch, you can have one of those hanging on your wall as well. So it's been a really exciting week for us. But I'm even more excited about having somebody come on to talk about very similar issues in Australia, a place that I've never been, but would love to go, if not for the, 24 hours plus flight between here and there. So Chris, if you could introduce our speaker.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. And thanks everyone for being here. And sorry for the delay in getting started. We had some technical difficulties, but everything should hopefully be working now. This talk today has been in the works for several months. The organization Fastrack Australia reached out to us back in July. We spoke with several of their key people after that, and Dr. Garry Glazebrook agreed to give this presentation today. Dr. Glazebrook is a transport and urban planner with more than 40 years of experience in government, consulting, and academia. His work has specialized in the evaluation and design of sustainable transport systems and their integration into the urban environment. His key areas of expertise include public transport network planning, the integration of transport and land use, transport operations analysis, and accessibility analysis. He has combined this public transport focus with a strong statistics and operations research background. He also founded the organization Fastrack Australia to raise awareness of the potential for higher speed rail. We thank Dr. Glazebrook and his colleagues at Fastrack Australia for working with us, especially given the 17-hour time difference. For those of us in North America this afternoon, it's now Friday morning in Australia. If you have, for everyone in the audience, if you have a comment, please use the chat feature. If you have a question, it makes things easier if you use Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll get to as many questions as we can. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Garry Glazebrook.
Thank you very much, Rick and Chris. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's actually quite a pleasant 9 a.m. at the moment. We're currently experiencing a bit of a heat wave in parts of the country, but where I am, it's a very nice day. So it's great to be here. And I guess we have some parallels between Australia and America in many respects. So I'll be very interested to hear towards the end of the discussion just what the latest and greatest is in the US. But I'd like to give you a bit of a rundown on what's happening in Down Under on high-speed rail. So perhaps we could go to the beginning of the slides, Chris?
Yes.
And maybe I'll straight on to the next one if you could.
All right.
So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the history of high-speed rail in Australia. I could spend an hour or two on that very, very easily, but I'll hopefully deal with that in a minute or so. And then go on to the question, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And talk about the establishment of the High Speed Rail Authority in Australia and the sort of approach that they're adopting to high-speed rail. However, we're also going to talk about what we see in Fastrack Australia as the reality of how we're going to deal with high-speed rail and what our approach in Fastrack has been. We established about 3 years ago and started writing some papers. I think we've got at least a dozen major papers and presentations, etc., on our website now. We're a non-profit organisation. a small number of people who got together to promote the concept of high-speed rail, but particularly how we believe it can best be adopted in Australia, given the geography of the country, the history of the country, the population base, and all the rest of it. Then we go on to just talk very briefly about some parallels that we see with the United States and where to from here. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Chris. This is what I've called the slow route to high-speed rail in Australia. You can see the buffer stops there. We've had a very checkered career looking at high-speed rail in this country, going all the way back to 1984, when the CSIRO, which is a government-funded research organisation, proposed building high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne. So that's now 40 years ago. We still don't have anything at this point. That one was actually quite a serious proposal, but it was eventually rejected a couple of years later by the federal Liberal. In that case, there was a Liberal government, or the same as your Conservatives, or Republicans, if you like, party. So it was about 6 years later, there was a new concept called very fast train, developed by the private sector, again for Melbourne, in this case, all the way Melbourne, all the way up to Brisbane, high-speed rail. And that had a number of major companies, BHP, which is was then a steel producer, but our big mining company, and Elders and Kumakaigumi, etc. So there was a lot of private sector backing at this point for the concept of a very fast train. And again, that was discussed and backwards and forwards by government, but eventually rejected by the Labor government in 1991. I won't go through all of the subsequent examples, but there are about another 8 or 9 attempts to get high-speed rail going in Australia that came, in most cases, from the private sector. They included tilt train proposals by various, actually in some cases by various governments. And finally, we come all the way now to 2021, when the high-speed rail was proposed again between Sydney and Newcastle, in this case, by the federal Labor government. So a very checkered career. You can see there that both sides of our parliament have rejected, time and again, have rejected high-speed rail as being either too expensive, impractical given our population base and the distance between our cities, etc. Maybe there are some hidden agendas there. Perhaps the major airline group, particularly Qantas, was doing a bit of quiet lobbying in the background. I won't comment on that, but for various reasons, governments of both political persuasions so far have kind of rejected a high-speed rail in Australia. Next slide, please. Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Well, this is the question. So the current Labor government, which is in power at the moment, came in power about 2.5 years ago. They announced that, yes, we would go ahead with high-speed rail. So this is the latest and greatest proposal. And they've gone as far now as setting up a high-speed rail authority. Eventually, they established it. They took about 18 months to get it underway, which was a bit of a shame. They promised 500 million, which of course won't go very far, but it's a start. And they've said their initial priority is between Sydney and Newcastle, which is, you can see the little yellow section on the map there. Newcastle is the second biggest city in New South Wales, and that distance is about 150, 160 kilometres through some very difficult terrain. A bit similar, if you like, going north from Los Angeles, if you like. You've got mountains and things in the way. Any rate, that's what they've proposed to do, is to build that as the first stage of an eventual high-speed route, again, going all the way from Melbourne all the way up to Brisbane through Sydney and Newcastle. They've started serious work, and they're doing a lot of a lot of boring to see what the tunnelling conditions will be, and I'll come to that later. So next slide, please, Chris. So the question is, how are they approaching it? How is the High-Speed Rail Authority approaching this? What's their program? What are they proposing in relation to funding and the timing and the decision framework that they're looking at? So they gave a briefing up in Newcastle a few months ago, and the next few slides are drawn from that briefing. So they're the official government position as of a few months ago, and so it'll bring you fairly much up to date. Next slide, please. So what do they see? What do they see as the benefits of high-speed rail? And I guess it's the same that you would say anywhere in the world, pretty much, and that is revitalising national industries, such as in this case manufacturing, strengthening local industries, boosting tourism, creating significant places, and decentralising the population. We have a problem in Australia that, although we're a very large continent, roughly the same area as the United States, but with only 27 million people, which is less than California, I think less than Texas now. So we're a very, very low population country given the amount of space we occupy. And yet the irony is that nearly everybody in Australia lives in a major city. We don't have very many people outside of the capital cities. Well over 2/3 of the population live in the largest 3 or 4 cities. So we have this paradox in Australia. I'll talk more about that later on. There is therefore really a need to decentralise the population out of our capital cities. We are pretty much the most unaffordable country in the world for young people to try and get into the housing market. Part of that is because we just crowd ourselves in a few very large cities. So decentralisation is a key objective of high-speed rail, and we'll talk more about that. There are a series of other benefits from high-speed rail. It would reduce, obviously, the demand for building more highways and airports. It would reduce traffic congestion, all those sorts of usual environmental benefits. And you can run high-speed rail on renewable energy straight away, so you're getting some benefits in relation to climate change and so forth. Next slide, please, Chris. Thanks. So as people do these days, they don't talk about railways in terms of engineering. They talk about it as a product, and they talk about it for customers. So what's it all about? The way the High Speed Rail Authority sees high speed rail is it's a new railway. It's separate from our existing rail systems, which are a bit antiquated as far as passenger rail is concerned. Obviously faster journeys. They're looking at essentially 30 minutes from Sydney to the Central Coast and 1 hour from Sydney up to Newcastle. As I mentioned, it's about 100, at the moment it's 160 kilometres by rail, but if you were to go on a more direct route, such as the freeway takes, it's more like 140 kilometres. They want to get from Sydney to Canberra eventually in 1.5 hours. At the moment, the train takes over 4 hours, which is the slowest train in the world, pretty much. And they want to get from Sydney to Brisbane and Sydney to Melbourne in 4 hours. By comparison, the current train to Sydney to Melbourne takes about 12 hours, and the current train from Sydney to Brisbane takes about 14 hours, which is amazingly slow. That's the reason why very few people travel long distances by train in Australia. Of course, they also want all the onboard experiences of Wi-Fi and all the other things that you get on high-speed trains around the world. Next slide, please, Chris. So they've said that their first priority is to build Sydney to Newcastle, and they're developing what's called a business case. It's due by the end of this year. In fact, it's due in about a month's time. They've been working away intensely on this for the last 9 months or so. And as it turns out, they have selected the most difficult part of the whole route, which I'll talk a bit more about. They're at the same time as they're developing a detailed business case for that section of the route, they're also developing what they call a product specification. And in the old days, we used to talk about planning, but these days it's all to do with marketing spin. So what they're really looking at is what sort of trains will be running, what will the travel times be, all those other things. What will the route be, what will the alignment be, etc., etc. And they're looking at that for the whole corridor between Brisbane and Melbourne in a fairly high level. That means that the corridor won't be detailed in great detail, but they want to at least know where they're going to start, where they're going to end, what cities they're going to go through, what routes they're going to take, etc. Next slide, please, Chris. The reason why they've chosen the Sydney-Newcastle as the beginning of this high-speed rail network As I mentioned, Newcastle's the second largest city in New South Wales. Current population of the lower Hunter region around Newcastle is probably about 650,000. It's not a huge population, growing quite fast, however. When you throw in the Central Coast in between the two cities, you've got well over, about well over 1 million people in that section going north of Sydney. Sydney is now, depending on how you measure the geographic boundaries of Sydney, somewhere between 5 and 6 million people live in Sydney. So it's a little bit smaller than Houston and Dallas, a little bit smaller than the Bay Area in California. Similar size, I guess, to Chicago in terms of population. So Sydney's Australia's biggest city, pretty much. Melbourne's pretty much the same population. And after that, Brisbane's about 3 million. So we have some fairly significant cities, but they're a fair way apart, which is one of the reasons why we've struggled to get high-speed rail up to this point. Next slide, please, Chris. And I mentioned that it's the most difficult part of the route. It's a bit hard to see this slide, and you might just be able to make out the topography there. But essentially, in order to get from Sydney to Newcastle quickly, you're looking about, the route is 165 kilometres all up, including going as far as, say, Parramatta in Sydney, all the way to Newcastle. Over half of that will have to be in tunnel. So we're talking about some of the longest tunnels in the world. Now, most people think of Australia as a flat place. We don't have any serious mountains. We do have some difficult topography, however, in and around the Sydney Basin. And that's one of the reasons why the existing rail line is so slow. It winds around, and as large sections of it have a maximum speed of about 80 kilometres an hour, 50 miles an hour. So the idea is to tunnel underneath these sandstone hills, and we're now very experienced in Australia in building tunnels. Sydney at the moment is in the midst of a major series of metro lines under construction. 60-odd billion dollars worth Australian, which is about 45 billion American, is being spent on metros in Sydney, and a similar amount of money being spent on metros in Melbourne, and not quite as much being spent on metros in Brisbane. So there's an enormous amount of construction happening at the moment in Australia on metro lines, and many of those involve substantial tunnelling. And in the case of Sydney, they're already building a number of metros which have got over 20 kilometres of tunnel involved in them. So they believe they're quite competent now at tunnelling through this lovely sandstone with tunnel boring machines. To build the Sydney to Newcastle route, they're looking at up to 18 tunnel boring machines, to give you an idea of the scale of the project. It's a huge project. They're looking at 10 years construction, and the first service is in the late 2030s. Next slide, please, Chris. Now, how much is it going to cost? That's a big question. In 2013, which was the previous major high-speed rail study, so going back about 10 years, the estimated cost all the way between Brisbane and Melbourne was 114 billion Australian dollars, which is roughly, I guess, 75 billion US. So that's a large enough sum of money, but it's probably doubled since then. Construction costs have been going up very fast in Australia, as they have right around the world. We have some of the most expensive construction costs in the world for various reasons. So we're looking at probably north of $200 billion Australian. It's an awful lot of money. And I think the government is looking at the federal government providing the bulk of the infrastructure cost. The state and territory governments could perhaps fund the stations. They would use land value capture mechanisms to try to recover at least a significant part of this cost over time. And presumably the private sector operator to run these trains would fund the actual rolling stock. Next slide, please. The decision framework, they're looking at a decision coming, well, early next year. The reports are supposed to go to the government by Christmas this year, or by the end of the year, end of December. We're due for an election coming up in no later than May next year, and people are now talking it might be as early as March. Unlike the US, in Australia, the political party in power can change the timing of the election. We don't have fixed terms for the federal government, so The precise date of the election is not known in advance, but it's probably between March and May next year. If there is a go-ahead decision to build this thing, they're looking at starting major contracts in 2027. So next year will be 2025 and 2026 will be the detailed engineering design work, particularly on the tunnels and some of the other infrastructure, with actual major construction starting in 2027. So that's not too far away if there's a positive decision and if the government is returned, or if the opposition comes into government and decides to also build high-speed rail, then construction could start within perhaps 2 years. And we're looking at then about a 10-year period of actual construction for the Sydney to Newcastle section of the route. Next slide, please. Now, what about the current reality? I mentioned Australia's paradox that we have a very small population given the size of the continent, but on the other hand, as you can see, the traffic congestion between Sydney and Newcastle can be very severe. We have effectively a 6-lane motorway between Sydney and Newcastle, which gets jammed up on a regular basis. So if we don't build high-speed rail, I think there will be a move to build a second parallel motorway, which will be fairly environmentally disastrous. The topography makes it very, very difficult, and there'll need to be significant tunnelling even with major roads. So there's the paradox. The challenge that we have is, how do we afford to build this sort of infrastructure between our cities, given our relatively small population? However, as I mentioned, we are spending an awful lot of money, as it turns out, on metros within our capital cities. So unfortunately, we're doubling down at the moment on the current population distribution we have in Australia. We are pouring all this money into simply catering for more and more and more people to live in the same few cities. We're not doing anything at the moment in Australia to encourage people to move out of those cities into nearby and smaller and more affordable cities. And this is where high-speed rail comes into the equation. High-speed rail will have a different effect from spending the money on highways. So the do-nothing alternative, if we don't build high-speed rail, I think we're looking at more airports and more highways. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, our problem in Australia is that most of us live in one of 3 mega regions based on Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. You can see the size of the populations there. You can see that around Melbourne, there are a series of smaller cities, around Sydney, the same thing, and around Brisbane, the same thing. So it's not only the population of those capital cities, but the immediate cities in their immediate vicinity. If you add those cities in, then basically nearly everybody in Australia lives in one of those 3 mega regions. All of these regions have got high housing costs, rising congestion, high costs of infrastructure. As long as we keep pouring people into those 3 regions, all of those problems are not going to be improved. The only way to really, a step change is needed in overall national policy based on decentralisation and based on high-speed rail to make it feasible for people to live further away from these regions, not just in them. Next slide, please. You can see this is some work that was done by the University of Melbourne, and they mapped accessibility, and you can see the pattern on the left. The big red blob down the bottom left is Melbourne, the red blob in the middle to the top is Sydney, and you can see that basically there's a lot of territory in between Sydney and Melbourne which is inaccessible, in the sense it takes you maybe 6 hours to drive from some of the cities in the middle there to get to either Sydney or to Melbourne. And as a result of that, all of the top quality educational facilities, health facilities, government services, high-paying jobs, all the rest of it are in the capital cities. Once you get out of the capital cities, we have a syndrome we call Sydney or the bush. Once you're out of Sydney, you're more or less in the bush. And that's the way Australia works. We don't have a collection of medium-sized cities in between our capitals. The map on the right shows you the same area and mapping the accessibility that would occur if we built a high-speed line between Melbourne and Sydney. You can see how cities along that route would suddenly gain accessibility. Most of them would be within 2 hours of one or other of the major capitals, which means people could live in those cities and still get to job opportunities. For example, with telecommuting 1 day a week or 2 days a week, you can get to the top quality education on health facilities. You can visit your friends and relatives. It would completely change the dynamic of where people could live in Australia and open up all of these vast areas which are empty at the moment. Next slide, please. So our fast track approach, we've been working on this now for about 3 years, is to use high-speed rail to integrate the mega regions. We're also saying that we need to be very careful about the sort of rolling stock we're going to use and the sort of trains that we're going to run and the sort of services we're going to provide. We also believe that realistically, we have to build this project in a series of stages and operate it also in a series of stages. Can't all be done overnight. In fact, it's going to take 30 years, 40 years to build all the way from Brisbane to Melbourne. In order to do that, we need a national passenger rail operator. At the moment, long distance trains in Australia, unless they're tourist trains, are basically provided by state governments, and they tend to have no interest in providing services to the next door state. So the same issue you have in America, the Amtrak was established a long time ago. In that case, passenger trains used to be operated by private operators. Amtrak was established when they decided to get out of running passenger trains. In our case, we have state governments that could run passenger trains but tend not to because there's no money in it, and they're more interested just in serving the people in their capital cities. We also need integrated urban development as associated with the rail. There's no point in just building rail. You've got to actually make that part of a total package of development and a total settlement plan. And in order to achieve all of that, we've got to change the governance arrangements, how we govern the way railways work in Australia. Next slide, please. So this shows how the three big mega regions, you can see the blobs and the capital cities and the regions around them. If we simply build faster rail coming out of those capital cities, we will improve the connections between the capital and the nearby cities, but we'll still leave the gaps in the middle. So our approach is to say we need to integrate this as a total national rail network with high-speed rail, with regional rail, fast regional rail, and also with faster freight trains as well, to take some of the trucks off the road. We have 10,000 semi-trailers and B-doubles a day on the Sydney-Melbourne freeway or the road, the Hume Highway between those two capital cities. A massive amount of, nearly all of our long-distance freight, other than bulk freight like coal and iron ore and so on, all the remaining bulk freight basically moves in trucks in Australia. We don't have the high quality rail freight operation that you have in the United States. Next slide, please. So we believe an integrated approach rather than just standalone high-speed rail or just dealing with fast rail around the capitals. We need a total integrated strategy will achieve benefits for all of those things, for long distance passengers, shorter distance commuters, freight efficiency, decentralisation and regional development, reduction in emissions, and improving housing choice and affordability. And these we think are key benefits from an integrated approach. Next slide, please. To achieve that, we need to accept the fact that different types of trains will be needed on different types of tracks, and therefore it becomes a technical issue about how do you integrate all of this into one system. High-speed lines typically have 25,000 volts electricity. They don't need heavy axle loads, but they do need high speeds, and therefore they need low curvature. The existing lines we have in Australia, the long-distance lines, are just essentially unelectrified. They have axle loads up to 30 tonnes. They don't have very fast speeds, but they often have very significant curvature, which means that the trains are running very slowly. Our inland rail and transcontinental rail systems, all the way across to Perth, for example, they take double stack containers, but pretty much the rest of the rail network at the moment doesn't handle double stack containers. We don't have the clearances to allow that. That's being changed now with the building of the inland, what's called inland rail in Australia. So we'll see similar sort of double stack trains as you have in the US. So different types of trains on different types of tracks with different conditions, axle loads, loading gauges, speeds, curvatures, gradients, etc. There needs to be a very thorough understanding about the requirements of different types of traffic and how different types of trains can operate into a total integrated system. Next slide, please. If we come to the Sydney-Newcastle corridor, you can see the squiggly line on the left. Now, that's not a child's drawing. That's the actual alignment of the rail line currently going through the Hawkesbury and through the Central Coast. And I mentioned the topography. Essentially, the Hawkesbury course is at sea level. Either side of the Hawkesbury, you're up at about 200 metres. So you've got extremely windy track getting down from 200 metres down to sea level and back up again. And around those water bodies. And that's the reason why the current train to Newcastle takes 2.25 hours to go 140, 150 kilometres. So we're averaging about 70 kilometres an hour is all we can achieve at the moment on our sort of passenger trains. Therefore, we do have to do some serious tunnelling to overcome that problem. Next slide, please. So we have looked at how you could build Sydney to Newcastle in stages. We think it's probably going to cost anything up to 40 billion Australian dollars, which is a heck of a lot of money. And unless the government is willing to allocate that scale of funds in one project, we believe it probably might have to be built in stages. So we've got, I won't go into the details of it, but suffice to say, we've looked carefully at how you could possibly integrate this with existing train services, how you could build it in stages, how you could operate it in stages. And that means looking at the specifics of what would be the speed limits on different parts of the network, what sort of trains could operate initially on 1500 volts DC, but then be able to operate as well on 25,000 volts AC, as well as freight trains operating in that corridor. It's quite complicated, and I won't go through the details, but suffice it to say, we've come up with some detailed plans as to how this could be built in stages and operated. Next slide, please. And that slide just shows you how there would be a build-up over time and how the trains would be handled both on the existing line and on sections of new high-speed line as it was added to the network, with more and more of the trains over time going on the high-speed line. Next slide, please. To do all of this, we need, as I mentioned, a national passenger rail operator. At the moment, if you think you've got bad passenger trains in America, come to Australia. We only have a total of 12 trains a day linking Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Canberra. That's extraordinary. There are only 2 trains a day between Sydney and Melbourne, for example, our 2 biggest cities. One runs overnight and one runs during the day. And they take so long that hardly anybody uses them. Most of our trains, you can see one of them there, are now 40 years old. They're all due to be replaced, but they're not being replaced by anything either faster or longer or more capacity or anything else. They're just basically being replaced with more or less a like-for-like replacement. As I mentioned, the reason for that is that the state government, these ones are run by New South Wales. So if you want to go to Melbourne from Sydney, you get on a New South Wales train. It trundles all the way down to Melbourne. If you're lucky, it might get there in about 12 hours. If you're unlucky, you might get caught behind a freight train, as happens in America. This is really not good enough. It's a really seriously bad situation. Consequently, nearly everybody flies between Sydney and Melbourne. It's the 5th busiest air corridor in the world. Next slide, please. We talked about integrated urban development. This slide just shows you how there will be a series of new development opportunities along the high-speed line, both in existing towns and in some cases greenfield settlements. This is what we see as helping to decentralise the population out of these overcrowded capital cities. Next slide, please. Now, how do we achieve all of this? I won't go into the details here, but one of our fast track people has, Ross Lowry, has written a detailed paper on how to change the governance arrangements. It's a real mess at the moment. If you're a private rail operator in Australia, as most of the freight operators are private rail operators, they have to deal with a labyrinth of regulations, all sorts of different requirements in New South Wales, from Victoria, from Queensland, from Western Australia, different radio systems, different signalling systems, different loading gauges, on and on. It's a real mess. So we need to fix up the whole way in which the rail system is governed in Australia. We started, and the reason we've got a mess is because they were always developed by state governments, not by, there was never a national rail plan in Australia. We still don't have a national rail plan in this country. We just have a series of things being done by state governments and a couple of private railways that carry the bulk of the coal and iron ore. So the really profitable bit in Australia is moving bulk commodities. The rest of it struggles against competition from air for passengers or road for freight. Next slide, please. So we finally come now to what's the parallel with the US, and I'm aware of the number of projects that are sort of in the either there are some things under construction, there are things that are being planned, there are things that are possibilities. Anyway, I'd like to hear more about what the latest and greatest is in the US following the election. But I must confess, a little bit nervous that there will be a withdrawal of funds from the previous program of upgrading Amtrak and putting money into the California high-speed rail and so forth. But anyway, I'd be very interested to know what's happening in the US, or what's expected to happen in the US now following the election. Next slide, please. So the situation here in Australia is a little bit similar to the US in that we have had a very checkered career in trying to improve long distance passenger services. We haven't really made any progress at all in Australia to this point. There is hope that the High Speed Rail Authority will change that. There is a lot of nervousness, however, that the government will balk yet again for probably about the 10th time and say it's all too expensive and they'll just shelve it. So we're waiting with bated breath to find out what happens in the run-up to the election. Probably within a couple of months, we will get a public release of whatever the government's plans are, and then we'll sit there for a couple of months until the election and see if the government gets back, and then if they decide to proceed, or if the opposition actually comes into power, what their plans will be. So we're in a bit of a state of limbo at the moment. We're not too sure what's going to happen, and I guess you might be in a similar situation in the US. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Chris and Rick. Happy to try to answer any questions. This is a list of some of the reports that we've produced, and they're all on our website. There's a video there, etc. And we've done a series of presentations. We've had lots of meetings with both government officials, local councils, community organisations and so forth, trying to promote, as I say, what we see as a more practical approach to the development of high-speed rail in this country, given the various constraints that we face. Thanks very much, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. This was very helpful. You know, I remember seeing what looked like a high-speed sleeper years ago, and then realizing that no, it was really a very slow train. It just kind of looks fast. So I understand the need for high speed. And I'm sorry that I've kind of missed it, but to clarify, you're an advocacy organization trying to build the case, like us, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And so you have, like, we've put together a few reports creating visions. It looks like you've been a lot more productive than we are in actually trying to create some more decision points or more helpful information on how to make decisions about this.
Well, we've been trying to, there have been a lot of studies done in Australia, so there's a lot of background information. Um, and the government is, yet again for about the 10th time starting to look at this. But every time they do, they end up concluding that it's too difficult, too expensive, take too long. And I think, the political payback is so far in the future, it's like 4 or 5 terms of government before you actually you get any benefits. And I think governments just balk at it because they just think they're not going to be around to see the benefits. They don't have the long-term vision that perhaps people did 100 years ago in Australia. Um, and that's a real political problem that we have in this country. So we're trying to find a way, how do you start this thing? How do you have a long-term plan that will roll this out over 30 or 40 years in the same way that countries like Spain have done? They developed a long-term high-speed rail plan. They now got the second largest or longest high-speed rail network in the world. China did, Japan did. In Europe, it's very common to have long-term rail plans, but we just haven't had them in Australia. We haven't had that long-term commitment. And the biggest problem we face is getting both sides of Parliament to agree to something. What happens in this country, as soon as one government gets in, they start to do something and then they're voted out of office before they've actually done anything. And the next government coming in just scraps everything that they've done, starts all over again. And so nothing ever happens. So unless we get bipartisanship, and that's probably a very difficult thing in the US as well. How do you get long-term bipartisan agreement about infrastructure? You can't build infrastructure overnight. And so consequently, I think the Western world, and in particular the Anglo-speaking world, Australia, America, UK, have been absolutely hopeless at building long-term rail infrastructure. That's my view of it anyway.
And there seems to be something about being a former colony of England that makes it difficult to do railroads. I've always wondered why that is. Because England's not doing very well with its high-speed rail project either. At least they got it started. Well, you kind of pointed something out. So you've essentially got the southeast corridor, right?
Mm.
Where there's a lot of the population is along this kind of string of corridors or cities. And then a lot of different political interests west of there because it's so spread out.
Mm.
How do you build a national thought around a railway program with such two very different, sections of the country, so to speak?
That's a good question. I mean, I think Adelaide could be incorporated into the high-speed rail network, and that would cover then 4 states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, and South Australia, as well as the ACT. So between those, they cover, 75, 80% of the population. The people who are outside of that corridor are sort of North Queensland and Western Australia and Tasmania. So I think nevertheless about 80% of the population would benefit from a high-speed rail or an integrated rail network solution for Southeast Australia. It is true that that's not really going to help people in Perth or in Cooktown or Cairns. But okay, it's just simply too far. They're just too far away, and there's not enough population in between to build high-speed rail all the way across to Perth. So they will have to continue to fly, I think.
Yeah. And then is there talk of, the very long route that goes across the country? That's the Indian
Pacific.
Indian Pacific. Is there any work towards rehabbing or improving that?
No, not really. I mean, it's what is it? It takes 3 days to get across by train. It's more of a tourist train. It's the alternative to driving all that way, which is an awfully long way away. It does have the longest stretch of straight track in the world across the Nullarbor Plain. But of course, they don't do massive speeds. They might do 120 kilometers an hour or something. That's where they run double stack trains all the way from Perth across to the eastern states. But again, there's a lot of desert in between and not many people. So it would never really, in my view, make sense to put high-speed rail across there, to be honest.
I would imagine that's true, yeah. And then to answer your question, we don't yet have an answer. So we know that change is coming. Uh, we're not sure what that change is going to be. But I guess we are girding ourselves for interesting change that's coming up. And certainly there's been a lot of attempts to stop California high-speed rail that have resulted in it being much delayed, but not dead. So hopefully we can make sure that the folks in California continue to move forward with that. I still tend to be very, very encouraged by Brightline West because the governor of Nevada has really worked for it, and it does have that mix of, at least it's got a little bit of private money in there. It's a lot of private money, but things tend to go better when it's a private company taking advantage, like Tesla. Tesla doesn't really work without federal subsidies, but it's lauded as a very innovative company. So I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you than that. Chris, are there any questions that we should get from the audience?
Yes, there are. And I wanted to let our speaker know as well that a number of people in the chat have said thank you and that they found this really interesting, including our board president, Maurice Ball. So thank you for doing this. Maria, a member of the audience, asks, are there any plans for new north-south passenger rail in Western Australia?
North-south passenger, not that I'm really aware of. They do have trains down to Bunbury, if that's where she's talking about, in Western Australia.
Yeah,
There is,
she didn't specify, but
yeah, there's a bit of a population base down in Bunbury, south in the southwest corner of Western Australia. But as I say, Western Australia is about the size of about probably 3 or 4 Texases, to give you an idea. It's about over a third of Australia, and it's only got 2 million people, and nearly all of those live in Perth. So, as I say, frankly, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot on passenger rail in WA outside of Perth.
okay.
Yes, they do have a couple of trains, but
A,
they
a
have one that goes across to Kalgoorlie, they have one that goes down to Bunbury and so on. 1 or 2 trains a day, that kind of thing.
Okay. In case it makes a difference, a clarification came in on the chat saying down to Albany and Broome.
Well, Broome's up in the other direction. Broome's right up in the north of Western Australia. So Perth to Broome is equivalent to Florida to Massachusetts,
Okay.
or beyond. So, no, I suspect not really.
Okay. Moving along, Ken asks, who's preparing the business case that you mentioned early in your presentation?
That's being developed by the High Speed Rail Authority, which the government set up. And these days we don't do anything without a business case. Once upon a time, governments made investment decisions based on long-term benefit for the country. These days we call it a business case, whatever that means. I'm not a great believer in so-called business cases. So essentially what that means is a benefit cost study. But the reality is the benefits from anything like this are going to take 50 to 100 years to come to fruition. If you're going to change the population distribution of a country, this doesn't happen even in 1 or 2 decades. It's a 50 to 100 year process. How you measure benefits in 50 or 100 years' time is beyond me. So I think there needs to be what maybe you can call a strategic business case where you're talking about what's good for the whole country. It's a bit like the decision to go ahead with renewable energy and build major transmission line networks and major energy storage facilities to really get, because of climate change reasons, that these are strategic national priorities, not something that makes money. You don't make money in a country the size and population density of Australia. You don't make money out of carrying passengers around, to be honest. I mean, you can cover the costs of the operations. You're very unlikely to ever recover the cost of the investment. But then we don't make money out of highways, and we build airports for the airlines, and so it's infrastructure is necessary for your economic system, and it's got to be significantly funded by government, in my view. So, as I say, I wouldn't call it a business case. I'd call it a strategic planning is what it should be called.
Okay. Well, thank you. And speaking of highways and airlines, Ken had a follow-up question saying you shared some cost estimates for the high-speed line. For comparison, do you know what would be the cost of the new parallel highway or expanding air capacity?
Well, in the case of Sydney, we're currently building the second Sydney airport out in Western Sydney, including all of the associated connections to the airport. We're looking at, I think it's $22 billion Australian for one airport. So if we don't build high-speed rail, we will need probably a second airport in Melbourne, maybe eventually a second airport in Brisbane. We will also need, as I mentioned, major new freeways. Who knows what the cost of another 6-lane motorway between Sydney and Newcastle? That's only Sydney to Newcastle. But, I think the cost will be at least the same as building high-speed rail, to be honest. Because the topography is the same, whether you're building rail lines or roads, you've got difficult topography to get through, particularly between Sydney and Newcastle. So it won't be cheap. And therefore, again, it's just such a eye-wateringly large sum of money to be spending on one project. This is going to be the challenge for Australia, to say, yes, we're going to go ahead and do this, even though it's going to take a fair bit of time to do it.
Okay, thanks. Steve asks a question that I think came up when you discussed the Sydney or the Bush issue. He asks, would spreading out the population mean additional stops for the high-speed railway would be needed?
Well, we've looked in detail at the operation of this, and we think that the capacity required can be met by a once hourly Sydney to Melbourne in each direction high-speed service with only a couple of stops, and then you'd have an hourly service as well that would be stopping at a lot of intermediate stations, maybe up to 10 intermediate stations. In addition to that, you'd have some regional fast services, and we're also looking at high-speed or fast freight trains at night that could go up to perhaps 160 kilometres an hour and get from Sydney to Melbourne overnight in the same time or less than trucks do. And the problem at the moment is the rail. If you load a container or take freight from Sydney to Melbourne by rail, it's about 15, 17 hours. The trucks do it in about 10. And so rail is just gradually losing its market share for freight between the major capitals. But if you could utilise the high-speed lines at night for fast trains when there aren't many or any high-speed passenger trains running, but fast freight trains, I think you could open up a whole new market. So we see this as being a much more, not just about moving passengers, it's also moving freight. This is lightweight freight. We're not talking about coal trains going at 160 kilometres an hour. We're talking about container trains and trains carrying pallets with sort of valuable freight on board. So this is why we're looking at a total integrated system. And we believe there will be enough demand in future to justify this, but that it will take some years and indeed possibly some decades to fully build up the demand.
Okay. Thank you. We're getting close to the top of the next hour. Since we started a couple minutes late, could we go a little bit longer? I'll ask, there's just a couple more questions here. Paulo referred to water security issues in Australia west of the Divide with a need for dams on the coast. Is this a factor in the plans you've discussed?
It can be. We've had this issue about water security for a long time in Australia, even in Sydney. There's been talk for 30 years about not having enough water for Sydney, and that's not even talking about places inland. And in fact, we built a number of desal plants in both outside of Sydney and outside of Brisbane. But in fact, what's happened is people's water consumption per capita has gone down and down and down. So we're using a lot less water per person. So Sydney has never actually had a problem in the end. I think the same thing can apply to all the various towns along the route. We have a thing called the Snowy Mountains scheme that was built 50 years ago, 60 years ago in Australia, built a lot of dams in the Snowy Mountains and turned a lot of water from the Snowy River inland into the Murrumbidgee and Murray rivers for irrigation purposes. But the amount of water needed for irrigation is orders of magnitude more than you need for urban use, for people to actually drink or whatever in cities. So I don't think the water problem is that serious, to be honest. I think it can be handled.
Okay. One last question, also climate related. The terrible fires in Australia about 5 years ago certainly made headlines here in the United States, and were seen by many as another sign of the climate breaking down. Is that how they're seen in Australia today? And if so, is that motivating interest in high-speed rail because it's more sustainable?
There certainly was a lot of concern about climate going back 3, 4, 5 years. I think to some extent, unfortunately, a bit like the US, it's sort of dropped out of the political discourse just at the moment. People are concerned about cost of living and all these kinds of things. Having said that, we're about to get more bushfires again. There are heat waves hitting Victoria right at the moment. Melbourne, I think, will be 36 degrees today, which is more or less close to 100 Fahrenheit. So I think if we get another bad fire season, which we do every 7 years or so, depending on where you are in the country, people will start to worry again about climate change. And so, electrified rail using renewable energy, we are currently running at just over a third, about 35% of our East Coast grid is now supplied by wind and solar and hydro. And that's going up rapidly. It's supposed to be 83% by 2030. That's the target, renewable energy. So electrified rail can run straight away on electricity and therefore on renewable energy. So taking some of those 10,000 diesel trucks a day off the Hume Highway, taking some of the people out of planes, taking some of the people out of cars, will have some, significant environmental benefits. But still, they're relatively small compared to the cost of building the thing. So the real economics are more to do with decentralization, I think, even than climate change. I think climate change is a useful thing. I mean, the benefits for combating climate change is a useful thing, but in economic terms, it's still a second order economic number compared with what you could get out of decentralization. In particular, housing affordability, which is a major problem in Australia.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's wrap it up for the questions. For our speaker or for Rick, any concluding thoughts or comments? Oh, Rick.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you doing this. Actually, I was invited to a high-speed rail conference in 2010, which I didn't make it to. But that was probably one of that cycles that you were talking about. So I'm glad to see that they're actually doing boring this time. And hopefully we will, both in the States and in Australia, continue to move forward. So for those, again, if you liked this presentation and would like to see more, go to highspeedrail.us and hit that Become a Member button, or go up to the Get Merch button and get a hat. So thank you again for coming. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Rick and Chris. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Cheers.